This is Israel at War. I'm Steve Conover. Last week here at the Friends of Israel's headquarters, our board of directors had the privilege to hear from Major Elliot Chodoff of the Israel Defense Force Reserves. We're sharing it with you because Elliot's insights give greater clarity into the ongoing war in Israel with Hamas and Hezbollah.
So the war that we're in with Hamas, Hisbah, and Iran and others did not start on October 7th, 2023. The war with Iran started the day Khomeini came to power in 1979. The war with Hezbollah started in 1981-82 when Iran created it in Lebanon. And the war with Hamas started in 1989 when it was created in Gaza during what was known as the First Intifada. And that war continues. It has continued since then and will continue, as far as they're concerned, until they are either defeated thoroughly or Israel is destroyed. That's the war. What they want is not an end to the war. What they want is an end to the Israeli offensive that's making it difficult for them to achieve their objectives. And that's a very important perspective because all the talk of ceasefire now is basically about giving them the breathing space to rebuild and do it all over again. That's number one. Number two, a lot of talk has come up recently about the fact that with all of what's gone on in the past year from the Israeli military perspective, look, Hamas is still firing rockets. They fired some today. Hezbollah, of course, is still firing rockets, and I'll deal with each of those separately in a moment, but I want to deal sort of with a grander concept. So therefore, since they're still capable of doing anything, clearly the Israeli strategy, the Israeli military offensive has had no effect on them. I was actually asked this in an interview yesterday, and I'll give you the response that I gave to that person. It's a historical conventional war response. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with it. On December 16th, 1944, the Germans launched an offensive that came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. This was less than 6 months before the utter destruction of Nazi Germany. It was 5 years into the war. Now, it was also turned out to be the costliest battle in terms of casualties that America had during that war. It was a massive offensive. They scraped together a huge armor reserve. Don't have to go into all the details, but to apply the same logic would be to say that given the fact that the Germans were able to launch an offensive in mid-December 1944, that means that everything that had been done up until then to them had no effect on them. Now, we all know that's utter nonsense. The conclusion that's being drawn from what's said about Hamas and Hezbollah is, and therefore we need an immediate ceasefire because the Israeli military is having no effect on them. Again, that would be the same thing as saying, well, it's time to end the war in December 1944 because clearly Hitler is capable of surviving endlessly. This is militarily nonsense. So now, having said those two things, there's been a shift in center of gravity over the past month or so from Gaza to the north to Lebanon to Hezbollah. Now, there are a number of reasons for that, but the primary one is that over the past year, we have essentially destroyed Hamas's military capability. I'm going to emphasize the word military. When we went into Gaza the actual offensive began in November of 2023, they were deployed in something like 28 battalions throughout the Gaza Strip. In an urban environment, and here anybody who's familiar with ground warfare knows the nightmare of ground warfare is urban warfare. And the nightmare of urban warfare is against a dug-in enemy with a civilian population that also has an underground tunnel network, and we faced all of the above. There were people in Israel, and I'm talking about former generals, who advised Netanyahu not to go into Gaza because the IDF would not be able to root out Hamas. Okay, so just to give you an idea, I have all respect for generals. They don't all know it all. In any event, through a slow and methodical campaign, I'm going to emphasize slow and methodical, we have rooted out their military capability. Of their original 28 battalions, they have a total now of slightly more than one still operating. We have destroyed a good deal of their weapons production capability, a huge amount of their storage, their command and control centers, their communication centers, their training centers. I can go on, but I think you get the picture. Now, having said all of that, they had also dug in rockets in launchers, and here rockets are different from artillery. They're simple to set up, they're simple to fire, they're cheap, and they're set up in underground launchers that can be remote fired from a cell phone. And that's what they're doing, essentially. Every now and then, they'll fire 2, 4, 6 rockets out of an underground launcher. By the way, underground and camouflaged, you essentially have to step on them to see them. And they declare that as a great victory. Keeping in mind that they fired over 1,000 on October 7th, their ability to fire 2 or 4 today would be, by any standards, a great degradation of their force. The numbers, to a certain extent, speak for themselves, and I'm not a great believer in statistics. I'm a believer in two of the great statements about statistics. One is liars never lie, statistics never lie, but liars use statistics. And the other was Mark Twain's famous, there are lies, damn lies in statistics. But nonetheless, and here I don't say this lightly, we've lost about 400 men killed in the Gaza operation, and we have killed over 20,000 Hamas terrorists in that battle. We're talking about, and again, keeping in mind that a force that's defending in an urban environment has force multipliers. In other words, their equivalency is much greater than their actual numbers. So we're talking about a huge, decisive battlefield victory against Hamas. The organization is not finished. It takes more than killing some of its members. They started with between 30 and 40,000 troops, plus administrators and others. But we have basically gotten them to the point where they're scrambling. And just a couple of days ago, we went on another offensive back into Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza to go after those who've come back. And this sort of back and forth is, or ebb and flow, if you will, is characteristic of counter-terrorist, counterinsurgency operations. In other words, we've shifted from a purely military to a more counterinsurgency kind of fighting. And that never really provides you with that, how can I put it, that victory moment, the flag on Iwo Jima kind of moment, or the surrender of the leadership kind of moment that you have in conventional warfare. But by all standards, the Army doesn't require the force that it needed down there. When we were fully deployed, we had 7 divisions operating in and around the Gaza Strip. Now we have 2. And by the way, none of this is military secret. And they're doing the job because we don't need more than that down there at the moment. And with that, about a month ago, we shifted our center of gravity to the north. Now, here again, if you were to follow the news, and don't get me started on the Western media, you would think that history began last week or 2 weeks ago. And Israel just decided one fine day, for no good reason, let's go into Lebanon and destroy that country. Here again, let's go back to October a year ago. The original plan by Hamas was for Hisbah to launch a similar attack on Israel a couple of days after the Hamas attack. And for a whole bunch of reasons having to do with the quick Israeli response, the mobilization of reserves, we had the largest reserve call-up in Israeli history and the fastest. Within a couple of days, there were 200,000 Israeli troops on the border with Lebanon, and Hassan Nasrallah, then head of Hezbollah, now they're not even sure where he's buried, but at the time looked at the situation and said, well, maybe we don't want to attack Israel with 200,000 troops on alert on their border. And what they did instead is started firing rockets and anti-tank missiles and drones. We evacuated nearly 100,000 residents of the north. And that's another thing that's not reported out there. There are nearly 100,000 Israelis who are displaced from their homes and have been now for over a year because their towns and villages have been bombarded on a daily basis. And here, let me add, not the rockets have done less damage to those places than the anti-tank missiles that Hezbollah has been firing directly across the border at homes. And in some cases, like the town of Metula, have essentially destroyed the village entirely. It doesn't exist anymore. It is rubble. Over the course of that year, we played, if you will, something of a tit for tat, but we did it with strategic thinking. We didn't want a two-front war. We could have fought it if we have to, but better not to if you don't have to. And getting rid of and crushing Hamas was a higher priority. But over the course of the months, we have been slowly but surely degrading a good part of Hezbollah's capability. Now, the official numbers were that Hezbollah had something on the order of 150,000 rockets a year ago. My estimate is between 300 and 350,000. And here I'll just say parenthetically, not because I'm smarter than military intelligence, although given some of their record over the past year, maybe it's not all that difficult. Here I'm joking. They're excellent. They had a major failure on October 7th, but excellent. But intelligence is locked into something that I, as a private analyst and a reserve officer, am not locked into. They can only report what they know. I can estimate what I think. What I mean by that is when they say 150,000 rockets, those are the ones they absolutely knew about. In other words, that they could count. What about the ones that were shipped in that they didn't know about? What about the warehouses and arsenals that they didn't know about? And then the great question, and by the way, and this is a discussion with intelligence officers, and they readily agree about this, although they didn't accept my numbers necessarily. The number, anytime you see an estimate, and by the way, this is true in virtually any real life situation, an estimate is always lower than the reality. And I'll give you an immediate one right now that was mentioned earlier, being faced in Florida with the hurricane. Whatever estimates you're hearing right now are low in terms of damage, in terms of injured, because what they know is what they know right now at this minute. What they're going to learn between now and tomorrow, it's not going to go down. It can only go up. How much? Hopefully not by very much. The official estimates will always be lower than the reality. In any event, over the course of the year, we've been slowly but surely lowering that number, but in a way that wouldn't get Hezbollah to the point where they say, we really need to launch all this stuff now because otherwise we're not going to have it. We also took out some of their leaders along the way. Fuad Shukr, most famously a few months ago, but others along the way, mid-ranking officers. And here I have to say that in many cases, especially in the short term, taking out mid-ranking leaders has more impact on an organization's capability than taking out its high-ranking ones. To speak in military terms, if you take out a bunch of company commanders and battalion commanders, you're going to do much more damage to the effectiveness of that organization than if you take out a divisional commander. The guys on the ground are the ones who are giving the orders and fighting the battles, and I'm not denigrating the divisional commander, but they're much more easily replaceable in the short term. A few weeks ago, we started with a massive shift. And that began with the pager and walkie-talkie strike. And here I can say that that was clearly, in retrospect, the beginning of this operation. In other words, it was not random, and you can ignore all the stories you heard about why and what. This was the first step of what became the full-scale assault on Hezbollah. Those two strikes, the pagers and the walkie-talkies, and here again, despite all of the criticism by people who don't know any better, mostly in the American media, about how this was terrorism and immoral and unethical, this was about as targeted as you can get. Pagers that were handed out by Hezbollah to their leaders, and again, not just the top leaders, all the way down into the system. And they were detonated after a message was sent. In other words, people actually picked them up to look at them to get the coded message. Of course, the message was that it blew up in their faces or on their belts or in their hands or whatever. A large number, and we're talking about thousands of commanders at different levels of Hezbollah, were killed and wounded those 2 days. Their communication system was shattered. What they thought was a secure communication system ceased to exist in a 2-day period. The following day, we struck at a high command meeting. The replacement for Fuad Shukr, who we took out a few months ago in Beirut, was the #2 commander in Hezbollah. His replacement was taken out the day after the walkie-talkie strike, along with the entire high command of their assault forces. The force is called Redwan. They were the ones who were supposed to go into northern Israel and do what Hamas did on October 7th. Their entire leadership was there planning for an October 7th type attack in Israel, and they were all eliminated. After that, of course, Hassan Nasrallah and his high command. Following that, Hashem Safieddin, his replacement, also taken out. The Hezbollah command is in utter disarray. And there was actually a report out of Lebanon today that stated that. And with that, last week, we went in on the ground, first with a single division, then with a second division. Today, we have 4 divisions operating in South Lebanon. We are in the process now of utterly destroying, first, their infrastructure near the border. And now, in my opinion, the next phase is going to be to move further, at least up to the Litani River, which marks the northern boundary of South Lebanon, and to clear that area as well, because leaving Hezbollah south of the Litani means leaving them within anti-tank missile range of northern Israel. By the way, that's also something that's missed in much of the analysis. The Kornet anti-tank missile, which they've used to such effect destructively in Israel, has a 10-kilometer range. Hezbollah is less than 10 kilometers from the Israeli border. It is still within direct fire range of Israeli towns. So pushing them north of the river and taking all of South Lebanon is critical to the strategy, and to the strategy to bring home and allow to the return of the nearly 100,000 Israelis who are displaced. Here again, the IDF in South Lebanon is overwhelmingly defeating the Hezbollah forces on the ground. 2 days ago, we took over the town of Marun Aras, an interesting town right on the Israeli border that had, overlooking the Upper Galilee on a ridge, a mock-up of the Dome of the Rock on a promenade, all funded by Iran, with Iranian flags flying. And I actually put up a post yesterday on Facebook. Anybody who's visited the northern border with me over the past years, I've pointed that out to them and mentioned that that complex was not going to last very long in the next war with Hezbollah. Now it's Israeli flag flying over. A significant symbolic victory, if nothing else. What we're also seeing, and I'll conclude this section with this, is an increase in Hezbollah rocket fire on a daily basis, but I need to put that in the proper perspective. Hezbollah's plan for the next war, which is what we're in now, and by the way, we're fighting now at an intensity of 2006. In other words, the gloves are off. Now we're no longer in the preparation for the preparation. This is the real thing. Their plan was to fire between 1,500 and 2,000 rockets a day into Israel. That was their doctrine. They are now firing between 100 and 200 a day, which, trust me, being on the receiving end is no pleasure, but it's less than a tenth of what they were planning. And the reason they're not doing it is not because they've suddenly become Western liberal Democrats. What we are seeing is increasing spasmodic fire. First of all, because they no longer have a command and control system. In other words, their local commanders, when they can get to their rocket launchers, are launching them. And we're seeing something else, and I think we're going to see an uptick of this over the next few days, that as the Israeli forces move in on them, we're putting them into what is known as use them or lose them. And while their doctrine may have called for firing X amount on a daily basis, when an Israeli tank brigade is rolling down on them and they know that they've got another 12 hours on this earth, they're going to fire everything they possibly can just to make sure they can get it up and into Israel. And with that, an increasing amount of fire toward Haifa, not only because Haifa is a more significant target than my little village here on a hilltop, but also because as they're doing it more spasmodically, their accuracy is declining significantly. And it's easier for them to fire at a big target like a metropolitan area of Haifa than into small towns and villages where their likelihood of missing totally goes up significantly. So that's where we are here at the moment. Last but not least, the third issue, Iran. Iran, commonly referred to as the head of the snake, and legitimately so. Here I want to make again, a sort of a general contextual statement about Iran and its connections around, and then come back with it to the significance of the war against Hezbollah. People talk about Iran's proxies and they say Hezbollah, the Houthis, the militias in Iraq and Syria, Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And that's a bit too much of a tossed salad to make any real sense. Hezbollah is not a proxy of Iran. Hezbollah is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Quds Force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. Okay, in other words, Hezbollah is Iran. Even though they're not Iranian, it is not a coincidence that on the day the pagers blew up, the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon had a Hezbollah pager on him. Okay. The connection between Iran and Hezbollah is direct. Hezbollah was created by Iran. The Shiite militias of Syria and Iraq and the Houthi militias of Yemen are proxies in the sense that they are Shiites who were taken under the wing of the Iranians. They are promoted by them for sure, and they see the world totally eye to eye. Mm-hmm. Hamas and Islamic Jihad are not. They are also proxies, but they are independent organizations that Iran is funding because they serve Iran's interests in fighting Israel and, frankly, fighting the United States, all of the above. And here, let me just add parenthetically, as much as the Biden administration was horrified by Israel taking out so many of Hezbollah's leaders, they were a little hamstrung in their criticism because it's kind of hard to criticize Israel for taking out terrorists that the State Department has millions of dollars of bounty on their heads. Many of these guys are the guys who were involved in blowing up the Marine barracks in the 1980s and the embassy in Beirut in the 1980s. So, by the way, you're welcome. Somebody pointed out in an article that in the last few weeks, Israel has taken out more terrorists on the U.S. wanted list than America has in the last 20 years. I'll say again, you're welcome. We didn't do it for you. It's okay, but you're welcome anyway. And this is all, all part of who is behind it all, Iran. Now, They launched two strikes against us, one in April that failed miserably, and one last week that failed. Not miserably, but failed. They launched 200 ballistic missiles at Israel. The West, and here I'm sorry to say, the United States, immediate response to Israel was don't escalate. Now, I don't know if they fired 200 ballistic missiles at America, don't escalate. Interesting approach. We've made it very clear that we're not going to let this pass without a strike. And here we're in the middle of the decision making and the coordination. And frankly, I don't know any better than anybody else, except it's way above my pay grade. There are essentially three possible categories of targets that Israel can strike in Iran. One is their nuclear capability. In my opinion, we're not going to do that. This is all opinion. This is not knowledge. Simply because we would rather have a coalition of the United States and others doing that. And here, with all due respect to the Israeli Air Force, and I have, despite the fact that I'm a ground officer, I have a great deal of respect for the Israeli Air Force. It's an Air Force of extremely high quality, not a huge quantity. In other words, we don't have a lot of planes that can make that trip multiple times to do the damage. We're talking about a well-entrenched, dug-in, dispersed nuclear system. And one of Elliot's iron laws is never strike a nuclear adversary and miss. So it's something that would be better done with the United States and others who might want to join in than to go it alone. And if we try to go it alone, we probably won't be 100% successful. And I believe less of a good idea, and I think unlikely. The second possibility is to go after infrastructure, particularly their oil export capability at Harj Island. They export 90% of their oil through there, and that's a real possibility. It's one that'll hurt. It'll also hurt the Chinese because they import a lot of that oil. It will have an impact, most likely, on the global oil market, and I think that's one of the reasons the U.S. is pressuring not to go that route. But I would say that that's got a decent likelihood of being the target. And the third target category would be military, Revolutionary Guards, regime control centers, in the hope that even if it doesn't bring regime change, and I don't think it will, because I believe the Iranian regime has more support than the optimistic Western analysts do, but it will turn them inward much more because they're going to have to deal with their own backyard before they continue their mischief in the rest of the region. So I would put those last two at a sort of even money bet as for the target that we'll go after. Last but not least, there was a lot of talk about will Iran come in to save Hezbollah? And the answer to that, I will go out on a limb and say emphatically no. Hezbollah was created to protect Iran. Iran is not created to protect Hezbollah. You don't trade your queen for a rook. You trade the rook for the queen. Hezbollah is the rook. And what's more is that with Hezbollah now being as weakened as it is, the Iranian regime is that much more vulnerable because they were counting on Hezbollah's rockets as a balance against an Israeli strike if it ever came. So, highly dynamic situation. I will preempt one type of question if you have it, and that is what's going to be. I don't do prophecy. Those who've heard me speak before know that I'm a disciple of two great political philosophers, Winston Churchill and Yogi Berra, who both said that it's best to prophesy about things that have already happened. I'm not going to go far into the future, maybe 15 minutes, but not much more than that.
We hope this special episode with Major Elliot Chodoff brings clarity to the situation Israel faces. We'll continue keeping you informed. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay current on everything related to the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry. Our workers in Israel and around the globe are not able to do the work of standing with and bringing hope to Jewish people without you. Please do not cease praying for them. Israel and the Jewish people continue to need our help. If you want to stand with us as we stand with Israel with a financial contribution, visit foi.org/standwithisrael.